Scout of the Endless Frontier. Episode 9, Stone and Smoke. By Elton Gar. In the 2 weeks it took to get to the edges of the frontier, Elias tried to plan. And he had the beginnings of a plan. As he got nearer to the frontier, he connected to the Pulse, a loose and constantly changing web of data shared by the scouts. Some data feeds appeared on the Pulse for minutes, others for days. Elias included the warning about the Nexari apocalypse in his data stream, but set an encryption timer on it. The data should spread across the Pulse to most of the scouts in a few months before it delivered its warning. At least that way, the scouts would recognize the signs if they saw them, giving the Commonwealth a few weeks or months of warning. But that just wasn't enough. He needed to find someone who had better contacts. Then he saw the only good choice. He groaned as he saw it. Tavik Holt was on the Pulse. He had worked with Holt 3 times. Each time, he had sworn afterward to never work with him again. Holt was a pompous blowhard, but he was also honest, and had all the connections that Elias needed. The message simply spoke of a dangerous job that paid well, and a location where they should meet. Elias arrived at Outpost 7 before Holt. It was one of the bigger outposts, run by the Pioneer Systems Alliance, with 30 permanent residents, though there were usually a few thousand people at the trading post. The docking fees were twice what they had been the last time Elias was here, but that included water and some basic maintenance if he wanted it. So, while the station mechanics were working, Elias and Rust made their way to the largest of the taverns on the station. There were several poker games happening, but Elias had never really found the point of the game, so he sat in the corner, and Rust laid down at his feet. Several people looked at the dog, but only one began to move toward them, and he stopped when Elias tapped the talon on his belt. He wouldn't actually shoot someone for asking Rust to leave, but he wasn't afraid to imply he would, and he had a reputation. Not so much that he would kill someone, but that he could. He was on his 3rd beer when Holt walked in. The beer wasn't good, but it was the first drink he hadn't made himself in almost a year, so he finished it and then let Holt come over to him. The man was taller than Elias, something accentuated by the sleek black hat that he was wearing. He had also grown a mustache that curled upward at its ends. It all worked to make him look like someone who was trying just a bit too hard. But the gun at his belt and the high-tech gadgets reminded Elias that if he didn't fully fit his reputation, it was only because of how large and impressive it had grown.
How is corporate life going?
Elias asked without standing up.
Over. I walked out 3 years ago.
Holt said.
Finally got sick of someone holding your leash.
Elias said, which got a huff from Rust. He didn't even own a leash for the dog, but the word still seemed to offend him.
I grew tired of parting with 30% of the profit.
That sounded more like Holt. He was the only scout that Elias knew of who had taken home more money than him, though he hadn't had nearly the number of adventures. Among other things, he usually had at least one person who was paying to be trained by him, and having corporate sponsorship was profitable.
I didn't come here to drink with you, Holt. We need to talk.
No need to drink. I'm just glad you're willing to put the pettiness behind you when there are people who need our help,
Holt said. Elias was confused. He knew Holt was looking for people for a job, but he hadn't really considered that he thought Elias was going to work for him.
I have no interest in working for you,
Elias said.
Perfect. I'll save the money. But we both know you're not the type to walk away from a fight like this, no matter what you say.
Elias waved the waitress over and ordered another drink. This was going to be easier if he was drunk. Then he said,
Fine. Give me the sales pitch. Then I'll turn you down and explain why I actually came.
There's an independent mining colony under pressure from Rift Logistics despite the colonists holding every legal claim to the mining rights.
But Rift owns all the guns. That explains why they need help, but not why Rift Logistics would want the rights. There are a million moons, and most of them are unclaimed.
How many of them sit on a deposit of Valorite?
Holt asked. That made perfect sense. There were very few minerals that were rare in the universe. But there were a few. Valorite was one of them, a mineral that sped up both the process of gene modification and lessened the side effects.
So, Helix is enforcing their monopoly?
Goodness no. That would be illegal. Rift Logistics is an independent security team hired by Ginevra Dynamics. It's just a coincidence that it's wholly owned subsidiary of Helix Biologics.
If you shoot me again, it won't go well for you,
Elias said.
You're still complaining about that? The plan worked magnificently,
Holt said.
You weren't the one who spent 2 weeks recovering from a plasma wound. Who else do you have?
Elias asked.
Key Voss said he'd consider it if I could get professionals to work with. I think you'll count,
Holt said.
That man is creepy. He's also better than any sniper I've ever worked with.
It is his eyes. But he now wears tinted glasses,
Holt said.
So who else is stupid enough to sign up for a job with no details, except that it's a suicide mission?
Ryle Terrick,
Holt said. He lowered his voice as he said it, and glanced around to see if anyone reacted.
Last I heard, he was in an ultra-secure prison for assassinating 3 different station commanders.
So it seems the rumors of you venturing beyond the frontier into the wilds are true. The prison was bought out by ForgeWorks Defense Consortium.
And they just let him go.
Don't be absurd. There is no profit in that. But he is on work release. Officially, he's a personal assistant, and it's costing 50,000 credits a day.
Is that everyone?
They're the ones with a reputation. There is also a Batrian mercenary and a stealth expert,
Holt said.
A mercenary? As in, you hired one instead of 50? Why put 6 of us against an army of corporate goons when you could have spent that 50,000 credits to hire a small army?
Elias said. At his feet Rust huffed and Elias said,
Sorry. There are 7 of us.
Because I don't plan to stay forever. The miners need to be able to defend themselves.
And I'm willing to help them do that, but I also have a hopeless battle that needs to be fought.
Elias said.
The one you came to tell me about?
It's already on the pulse, just time-locked. But I need a payment for my help.
I wouldn't expect less. What is your price?
Your contacts. All of them. This information has to get out, and you have far more access than I do.
Many will not be receptive to being contacted.
Then let's hope the rest are enough to help save humanity,
Elias said, and put out his hand to shake Holt's, still uncertain he trusted him. The Ghostwake took off as soon as Elias and Rust got off. Its autopilot, taking the ship to a random location on the other side of the planet where it would be safe. The mining town could have been on 100 different worlds on the frontier. A few makeshift buildings from local materials, a couple of small metal shelters that would have been filled with supplies until they landed, and a load of semi-permanent tents. The only major difference from the farming towns were the boulders that were scattered around the town and the piles of rock and gravel that had been pulled out of the mine. Those would be useful in the battle that was coming, though Elias feared with few trained soldiers it would be more useful for their enemy. As he moved into the mine, he realized that wouldn't matter. The reason that the things outside were so ramshackle wasn't because of lack of money, it was a lack of motivation. Because the mine itself was not only clean and organized, but had excellent modern equipment for cutting through and processing stone. They were approached by a woman dressed in heavy work clothes and holding a tablet.
So you are the mercenaries. I hope you're worth it.
Elias questioned what Holt had been paid. The man had always had near unlimited funds. But Elias wasn't clear how he got it. And there was no way that these miners had enough to pay 50,000 credits a day. He looked at the woman, who seemed to be a foreman, and said,
We could turn this place into a kill box, easy enough. A dozen trained soldiers with plasma rifles could hold this against 100.
I'm glad to hear it. I was afraid we were going to have to fight.
the woman said, seeming to misunderstand.
You are the dozen.
Holt said, then glancing at his belt he said,
One of my men is here.
Stealth expert.
Elias asked.
So I presume. I received an encoded message with a distorted voice that said, arrived.
Over the next hour, the team arrived. The biggest surprise was the Beatrian. She turned out to be a female. A bit of an oddity, since only 1 in 5 Beatrians were female. But while most had more important roles than soldier, the ones who fought were every bit as dangerous as any other Beatrian. Towering over Elias, she stuck out a hand as big as his head and said,
Greetings, I am Jessa.
A few minutes later, Kivas appeared. He carried 3 large boxes of equipment and wore gold-tinted glasses that covered up his eyes. Elias had met Ki once just before Elias got out of the army, but he had clearly been working with Helix Biologics since then, because he had several more augmentations. Likely specialties, since Elias didn't know what they were. With the rest, Holt tapped something into one of the devices, and a few minutes later, Rial Tarek walked in. Elias had heard the name spoken of both in reverence and terror. Either way, he was one of the most feared men in the Commonwealth, having assassinated 3 different station commanders and escaped after each one. What was worse, especially for the corporations, was that they still didn't know exactly how he had done it. And it turned out one of the most feared men in the Commonwealth was 5'2", with a round face and a rounder belly. Only the large metal bracelets around both his wrists and ankles made Elias entirely convinced this was Rial.
Do you have the equipment I requested?
Rial asked, his voice almost a squeak. Holt nodded towards one of the boxes he had brought in, and Rial turned away from them and walked over to it without another word.
What keeps him from killing us all and escaping?
Kivas asked as he lowered his glasses to look at him, revealing eyes almost twice as large as they should have been with 2 extra iris rings. Elias hadn't spent enough time around Ki to know what that did, but he suspected he could focus in far better on things at a distance. If so, it was almost cheating. For a moment, 4 of the most dangerous people in the Commonwealth watched Rial begin to open boxes of equipment, as Holt said,
I have a code. If I don't enter it every few hours, all 4 of the pieces of jewelry will explode.
And what about the rest of us?
Jessa asked.
Try not to give him a reason to kill you.
Elias said, and then taking Rial's lead also left the small group to work on his own project. But unlike Rial, Elias was focused on the miners, since training them to defend themselves was why he was here. As he gathered them together, he couldn't help but think about the Nexari and how similar this was to what he knew about them. In both cases, he was trying to rally a group of entirely outgunned people to fight a battle that they almost certainly couldn't win. And he hoped that the comparisons continued because the group of rough-looking miners were keen to defend themselves. They still hadn't seen the stealth expert when the enemy troopship arrived. A detail that either made perfect sense, as being hidden meant they were good at their job, or suggested that they were simply not there. Either way, that became less important when the troopship landed just outside. A single man stepped out of the ship, and Elias immediately began to plan for how they could abandon this plan. The man was in power armor, not entirely surprising, but the type was. Elias had only seen corporate executive-level power armor twice. That was because it was likely more expensive than the starship that had brought the man here. It was also practically a death sentence for anyone who went up against them, as it was nearly indestructible. The man walked up as if he knew that, though the bounce in his step suggested that he hadn't used the armor enough to be used to the extra power that it gave him in every step. And as the red dot from Key's position appeared on his chest, Elias tapped his comm and said,
All that's going to do against armor like that is give away your position.
If the armor was the entire problem, they might find a way to deal with it. A single man, even one that was all but unkillable, couldn't hold a battlefield, and nothing about the way he moved suggested that he was a good soldier. But the armor suggested a second problem. There was no way a frontier mercenary could afford that armor. That meant Ginevra Dynamics and ultimately Helix Biologics was more involved in this than Elias had hoped. And if they decided to, they could send thousands of troops to this world. The enemy commander stopped just outside of the cave entrance and waited. The miner's spokesperson moved to meet him, but Elias held up his hand and she stopped. After 5 minutes, Elias took out one of his energy bars, sat down and began to eat. The others slowly seemed to get his point and went back to what they had been doing, with only Holt, Rust and Jessa staying entirely vigilant. Or at least appearing to, because while Elias did his best to look relaxed, his hand never left the grip of the Talon. He almost felt bad for the enemy commander when he finally stepped into the cave. It would be clear to anyone that he had just lost the first battle of this minor war. And while no one was hurt, his authority had been undermined. He gained a small measure of that back when he amplified his voice with the armor so that it echoed off the huge stone walls.
Your time is up. Surrender the mineral rights to this planet immediately, or we will take it.
It was Holt who finally approached him, his hand on a gun that cost 100 times as much as the Talon and was probably 10 times more likely to break. But then, unlike Elias, he likely had several more. He had always liked his toys. Elias hated to admit how often they were useful. But this time it wouldn't be. Holt held out his hand to the man and said,
Tavik Holt, but everyone calls me Holt. Good to meet you.
The armor likely saved the man again, but this time from the realization that he was facing a scout legend showing on his face. Not that the books that Holt sold about his exploits had any truth to them, but he did understand the value of his reputation.
I am Commander Victor Halloway. You may call me Victor,
the enemy commander said.
Under what authority do you claim rights to the minerals on this planet?
The first law of the frontier. If you can't hold it, you don't deserve it. This is mine because we have enough resources that it won't be taken from us immediately,
Commander Halloway said.
Then come and take it,
Holt said. The armor stood there for a moment, and Elias could imagine the confusion on the man's face, but the armor kept Elias from seeing it. The enemy commander then turned and walked out, ending negotiations.
So, how do we evacuate?
Elias asked.
But you came here to fight.
The miner's spokesperson said, confused.
That power armor is enough to take this place on its own, and we gave him no choice but to come back with overwhelming force or look like a fool,
Elias said. Holt considered that, but it was the Beatrian who said,
He's right. That armor is a huge problem, and this was going to be an impossible fight before we knew about it.
The 7 of us aren't going to win this fight. And even if we do, it won't matter. Not if Helix cares enough about this to send that armor out to a rookie commander. Which is what I think they did.
I've heard stories of you. How many unwinnable fights have you won?
The miner's spokeswoman said.
None. Because that's not how battles work. The people in them don't win, they survive if they're lucky. And if we put people with pickaxes up against soldiers in power armor, they're not going to be lucky.
So you want them to just let the corporations have whatever they want? If someone doesn't stand up to them, they'll take over the frontiers the same way they have the rest of the Commonwealth,
Holt said.
Then what do you suggest?
Holt sat down on one of the stones and looked more tired than he had before. He then glanced around to make sure no one else was near and said,
I don't know what to do. I'm not a soldier.
You were in the military. That makes you a soldier. And even if you weren't, I've seen you in a fight.
I was in the military. But not in the way you were. My family were some of the first planet harvesters. We have stakes in some of the most important habitats in the Commonwealth. I get 0.1% of all the docking fees for Atlas Station. I joined the military because I want to become a station commander someday, and people are more likely to elect someone who was in the military. We also paid to make sure I was never in any real danger. I joined in the middle of a war and spent 4 years flying drones. The most dangerous situation I was in was when I got drunk in the bar.
It all made sense. Holt had always acted better than everyone else. That was because, as far as most people in the Commonwealth believed, his wealth made him better. And the use of technology that had seemed excessive for a scout seemed reasonable for someone who made as much in a day as Elias did in a year. Even the desire for a reputation made sense. For people who didn't know what a scout was, it was a job filled with adventurers and heroes. The only thing that didn't add up was standing up against Helix for a bunch of miners. Though as planetary harvesters, his family had been miners too. Even if that mining involved strip mining a planet down to the core.
This only builds your reputation if you survive.
Elias said.
Then I guess I need to survive.
Holt said, standing up, a dangerous look in his eyes. The look of someone who had decided that there was something more important than their life. And that solved that. Elias could leave, but Holt wouldn't. So they needed to find a way to win.
They have explosives. I can work with that,
Elias said, and his mind began to shift away from how to turn miners into soldiers, and began to consider how the skills the miners already had made them dangerous. Perhaps dangerous enough to survive the battle that was coming. Author's note.
One of the most basic rules of writing a short story is to limit the number of characters. Characters need space to develop, or no one is going to care about them. So, thinking I could have 7 characters in a short story, and have 5 of them be new, and keep it to 1 episode, was a pipe dream. That is to say, I should have known from the beginning that this story was going to take more than 1 episode. I'm not sure that 3 wouldn't have been reasonable, but as much as I enjoy having an occasional 2-part episode, it makes keeping up with the monthly themes a lot harder. So I hope you enjoyed this, and will come back for part 2 next Tuesday. I've already written the rough draft, and I'm really enjoying the story. Thank you. Elton Gar.